Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this evening, coming out/in. We're very glad to have you all here tonight for our first webinar version of the Robert Lowell Memorial Lecture Series. We hope to get through the evening without any technical glitches, but please bear with us should we run into any. My name is Annette Frost. I'm the director of the Favorite Poem Project here at Boston University, and we are very excited tonight to be joined by two extraordinary poets, Natasha Trethewey and Megan Fernandez. Before we get started, I just want to mention that immediately following the reading, there will be a Q&A with our readers. So if you have any questions for Natasha or Meg, please send them via the chat box, and after the reading, we will select as many questions as we have time for. That being said, I would like to hand the screen over to the founder of the Favorite Poem Project and the director of BU's Creative Writing Program, who will introduce the series. Please welcome Robert Pinsky.
Hello, everybody. It's a wonderful role I have every year to explain why this poetry reading series has a subtitle. It is called the Robert Lowell Memorial Series, In the Spirit of Room 222. And this time, I'm going to talk about two people in relation to the series before I introduce the wonderful young poet, Megan Fernandez. Room 22 is where Robert Lowell taught a BU creative writing class in which the students included George Starbuck, who used to have my job, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton. The spirit of Room 222 is partly the spirit of Robert Lowell. I knew Robert Lowell, and the spirit of 222 is related to his intense, unacademic, unhierarchical interest in the art of poetry and its history. If he was with some young poet, he was just as intense as if he was with his friend Elizabeth Bishop. It was like taking an oral exam. What do you think is Robert Lowell's, what do you think is, he would say, what do you think is Alexander Pope's best writing? And I can remember him scolding me because I was dismissive about Emerson and Thoreau as preachers. His aspiration in poetry was not to win prizes or be famous or publish things everybody read. He was very aware of the great room of the history of poetry. He was in some sense a contemporary, not just of Whitman and Dickinson, but of Horace and Dante. In that room, Lowell was the teacher. Plath, Sexton, and Starbuck were students. When I discussed the founding of this series with our benefactor, Nancy Livingston, who through the Shenson Foundation set things up, it was Nancy who had the idea to call the reading In the Spirit of Room 222. Nancy Livingston, an extraordinary person. Her professional life was in advertising. She scorned the term public relations. She liked advertising. And it's hard for me to believe that next month will be the 1-year anniversary of Nancy Livingston's death. She was an uncomplaining, imaginative, funny person, and that unhierarchical spirit in which Lowell, Plath, Starbuck, Sexton were artists together. They were poets. It wasn't their rank. That spirit is quite consistent with Nancy, who understood it very well from my narrative, maybe saw into it better than I did. So I'm honored and glad to bring into the room uh, the ongoing presence of Robert Lowell and of Nancy Livingston. Megan Fernandez fits that spirit in many ways. I'm not sure anybody else, there have been many people who have entered the BU MFA program who have already published books. We've had an MD or two. I'm not sure anybody came here having published a book and wonderful chapbook as well, and completing a PhD at the University of California. I suppose one might have worried, I don't remember, was this person going to be too accomplished to fit in with the group? On the contrary, I guess it was about 10 years ago, she animated and was part of an extraordinary group that year. Many books have come out of it. And Megan's attitude in class was in that spirit of just being devoted to learning, just wanting to pick up everything she could. My fellow teachers, you know that the best kind of student is the one who wants to pick your brain, who just wants to know. And that aesthetic, poetic, intellectual curiosity also is there in the writing. The writing is, I guess the fancy word would be syncretic. The new book, Good Boys, you have a mix of all the different possible feelings and histories of sexuality, gender, nationality, none of these things being pure, all being mixed, fluid, still being made up, and eminently worthy passion, love, anger, always something else. It makes, in my mind, it makes Meg very well equipped in the tradition of this series. A BU alum, a recent BU alum, introduces our main reader. And I, with my colleagues, always try to find a good match between the BU alum and the reader. I don't think I have to say much. I think you will see that in that spirit of fluency, wide-ranging embrace, and passion, this is a good match. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our first reader, Megan, who will give us a reading for about 10 minutes, I think, and then introduce Natasha Trethewey. Megan, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna cry. It's so moving to be here, even in virtual space with you, Robert. I wanna thank Caroline and Annette and the current MFA students who Natasha and I had the honor of speaking to earlier today. And I'd also like to say a quick shout out to my cohort who I see in the attendees. I miss you guys, and everything I write always has the echo of you with me. I'm going to start reading a poem called nukemap.com, and it's about during 2017 when there was a lot of conversation between the president and the leader of North Korea, and I was having kind of nuclear anxiety and nuclear despair. I found this website, which you can go to, in which you can see the different bombs, the nuclear arsenal of the whole world, and it has these default target cities, and it's kind of sinister, but I also had no idea that the bombs had names, and so the poem's a little bit about that. Nukemap.com. It is 2:37 a.m. and I make myself eat an apple while on the laptop Alec Baldwin is hosting Match Game, an experiment in the ageless art of game show hosting, like Orange Light diving back into the 70s. In an open tab, I am dropping nukes on New York City to watch the airburst swell into a new species of hydrogen fruit. I do this over and over until each bomb becomes a sun that you detonate virtually into the night. Davy Crockett and Little Boy, Fat Man and Ivy Mike, Gadget, Castle Bravo, and Tsar Bomba. All of the bombs are named for boys with fathers from Pakistan and Russia, Sly America, or the green sea waters of a Korean dream. Some of the really bad nukes only have numbers and are unnameable, like B-83, because you can't name something that can kill 1.8 million people, even if you are its mother. You detonate the bomb and listen to Gravity Rides Everything. You detonate the bomb and still think the 90s will save you. You tell your roommate that if the bomb goes off above 39th, you might both survive. New York City is the default target on nukemap.com. This is so unquestioned that you clutch your O'Hara and handwrite David Trinidad a letter in Chicago to tell him about nuke anxiety. He doesn't even know you well, but he was nice once in the lobby of the Marlton on 8th Street when you recited Creeley and talked for 3 hours, and lately you only want to be around people over 60. You still expect them to save you. You still believe in elders. You can get the second season of Match Game on abc.com for free. You can watch all your favorite comedians from 1992 come to life resurrected like clay prophets, saying that you can live in the television where nothing will incinerate you. You are back in Seinfeld's apartment, and all that matters is that Jerry doesn't want to date someone with man hands. All our futures are like time beating backwards into sitcoms with the laugh tracks of the dead, and the apple in your mouth is now an organism you slew in your throat, and each of your sons, Davy and Mike, and Bravo and Fat Man, are standing on top of a heap of nuclear soil that was once a very specific girl, let's call her Anna, and they are asking you to forgive them like any mother would. Actually, I kind of like this sort of empty void silence of the virtual reading. I'm kind of getting used to it. So this next poem came out in the New Yorker last year, not to flex, was very excited about this. And this is like the first moment my parents really started to take me seriously. This poem's called Scylla and Charybdis. And obviously if you've read the Odyssey, you know that Odysseus has to decide whether he's gonna go with his ship, with his men, between this like whirlpool and then this sort of terrestrial monster rock. He has to make this decision knowing that he's gonna lose people either way. Scylla and Charybdis. I like when the choices are both ugly, the rock and the hard place. Odysseus chose Scylla, and I too would have opted for a terrestrial evil, the sea vortex probably concealing some subterranean meat with its beauty. Soon you and I will exist in different time zones. While day breaks for you, night will hold me to the big, wild moon. I cast a wakeful light unraveling across the ocean. While you swim in open Spanish waters, brushing the bright-eyed fish, I spin in a street of yellow cars, nod off to an organ in a small church on Broadway. When you face the queen Medusas in the water, transfixed by their pale, rosy pulses, their accusatory look of afterlife, know that you are facing me. I am them in hundreds, blind and mutant, ready to greet and interrogate your days. These hallucinations are such a small price for your face. I keep myself busy and disoriented. I trace our disappearing homelands through myth. I understand now that to love radically is to always be willing to be banished to some disfigured island of stone in the middle of the sea, a small sacrifice really. I too might have sacrificed a few men to preserve the whole idea of a voyage, or even a nation, both false beloveds. That's the thing. Our hero didn't really want to go down with the ship. Wily, he skidded the sea cosmos. He knew the milk foaming at the whirlpool's edge was bad medicine and chose the lesser of two omens, a prophecy where the weak get plucked. And you sail on home fine, just fine. Okay, so I'm going to read two more poems. This poem is for a friend, Sam Sachs. He's also a great poet. And when we were sitting in a bar one night, and he's like, "What's your book called?" And I'm like, "It's called Good Boys." And he's like, "Is it about a dog? Like good boy, like a dog?" And I was like, "No, it is not about a dog, Sam." So this is for Sam. Conversion. Sam says you can't name your book Good Boys without a dog, but Sam doesn't know that I am the dog. I am the ultimate mutt, and I am telling him this story at a bar called College Hill Tavern, which looks like a front for some operation where all the bar stools appear as if they were staged under 10 minutes. And the girl with the fake lashes knows I like a double gin. And I'm telling Sam that I was the dog who was converted when I was 17, and my mother found an essay about how I was in love with the girl, and there's a Portishead reference in case you need me to date it. And this was way before the liberation of the young and the white twins on YouTube who come out to their dad and everybody cries and transforms. When I see those kids, all I think is they never had parents who were immigrants and who sent you to a lady and told you to solve it all in one session because this therapy was expensive. It wasn't traumatic. It was funny. And I remember the couch. There were multiple couches and I had to choose a spot, and I sat on the couch farthest from her, and this wasn't the first nice lady who looked at me like I was a dog. And Sam, when I said it is called Good Boys, what I meant was that I was a good boy and loved good boys and good men and still love them. But you see, I was 17 and alone, and nobody gave me anything except one book by Dickinson, and she was so neat, so precise, so human, and I wasn't. I just wasn't. I was just a dog. I wasn't even that good. And this last poem is actually a new-ish poem, meaning it's not in the book, and it is in the recent Los Angeles Review of Books. And it's kind of like a funny, sad, funny, devastating poem, and it's called Do You Sell Dignity Here? Do you know what aisle they sell dignity? I say to the store clerk on University Avenue. It's a cold October, Frank Ocean's Moon River croons in my head, and earlier that day I lay flat in the bathtub like a wild infant, shower pouring, thinking of that Dickinson poem where she says, quote, a bomb upon the ceiling is an improving thing. Steam gathering in celestial curls, I imagine bombs fizzing out, gas and me, radioactive with love. At the grocery store, I ask where they sell dignity, and when the clerk says, sorry, what did you say? I explain that I am looking for dignity, having lost so much in the last year, and was wondering if it was neatly placed by the baking powder or perhaps refrigerated with the perishables given its fragile shelf life. And yes, I really did ask this, partly because I was being funny and trying to make a friend, but also I would have taken a hug or any acknowledgement that I am a person who can laugh at myself despite walking with that odd angle of defeat. Children have no dignity, and I really admire that about them. I love their ruthless response to injustices, their desire to feed birds in the park, to grieve the sea, their right to be tired in public. Do you sell dignity here? I ask one last time, and then tell them about how it went down, how I had lost mine in Bushwick, of all places, near a building covered in glass, and white girl gentrifiers having their white girl epiphanies, such bad coming of age trash. Jesus, all my parents' sacrifices for this, for what? Is this why I came here from Africa? They would say over my flat body, hopefully in the shape of a shrug. I am undignified. I prey on fluorescent light. I enter through the automatic door of grocery stores with roll, glide feetless into an even white. I greet peaches and body cauliflower, nod to the pink packets of sweeteners and wrapped meat thighs. I am drawn to the milks and oblong fruit, dent a red Campbell can of soup. I want everything as cheap and damaged as this feeling. When they go low, we go high, a president's wife said. I go low some days. I go so low you cannot tell me, from the animals we sell, from the hard grain my body has become. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to introduce Natasha Trethewey. And I'm going to read a very short bio of Natasha's very extensive bio, and then I'm going to read a little bit about her work and what it's meant to me. Robert and I were sort of talking about this, and he said, you know, show the ways that you love her poetry. And I said, yeah, I can do that. So this has been such an honor to read and to introduce you, Natasha. Natasha Trethewey is a former U.S. Poet Laureate and the author of 5 collections of poetry, as well as a book of creative nonfiction. In 2007, she won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for her collection Native Guard. And in 2018, her book Monument was longlisted for the National Book Award. Among her many honors, Trethewey is the recipient of a 2017 Heinz Award in the Arts and Humanities category, as well as the 2016 Academy of American Poets Fellowship, which recognizes distinguished poetic achievement. Trethewey has also received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Study Center, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Bunting Fellowship Program of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard. In 2013, she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and at Northwestern, she is the Board of Trustees Professor of English in the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. In her second term as the United States Poet Laureate, Trethewey's signature project was a PBS NewsHour poetry series where poetry lives. In this series, Trethewey traveled with senior correspondent Jeffrey Brown to cities across the US in order to explore social issues through the prism of poetry, literature, and her own personal experiences. In addition to being the Poet Laureate, she also held the position of a state poet laureate for Mississippi from 2012 to 2016. So that is the official bio, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about her work. So in poetry, I'm often preoccupied with the role of the beloved and question what it means to address another, to interpolate them, to beckon them back from the dead or from the dead meat of our own hearts, to conjure beloveds that could not exist. And what I love about Natasha Trethewey's poetry is how close she keeps her beloveds. They are never abstract. She carries them on her back, buries them in her chest, and casts lines out into the river, hoping to become entangled with the sign of a beloved in a watery afterlife. Trethewey tracks the way beloveds appear estranged and familiar to us, terrestrial and cosmic, like in one poem where her father and the moon become interchangeable. She writes, quote, "Like the moon that night, a distant body, white and luminous, my father stood in the doorway, and later, quote, he watched over me as I dreamed." This exchange of animacy between that which will outlive us, the moon, and that which we will most likely survive, our parents and our origin story, strikes me as a poetic optimism, maybe even magic, that is distinctive to Trethewey's work. This idea that our beloveds are shapeshifters and maybe even guardians. There are many words that come to mind when I think of Natasha's poetry: elegant, meticulous, interrogatory, deliberate, and theatrical. But mostly what I admire about her poems is how each one is a pilgrimage for the reader. By pilgrimage, I of course mean the traveling to a holy place, and in Trethewey's work, the reader pilgrims through history to undo its official record and destabilize its norms, particularly around its treatment of women and people of color. And I actually thought, since this is a moment of being remote, that we can actually take advantage of it. I wanted to talk over one of the chalk drawings that Natasha writes a poem about. So I'm going to share my screen. In the ekphrastic poem entitled Knowledge, written about a chalk drawing of the dissection of a young woman's drowned body, Trethewey describes the group of men, scientists presumably, who encircle this, quote, Venus de Medici, risen from the sea, sleeping. The poem depicts the way the woman becomes an object of study, and the way objects of study become objects of enthrallment, disguised as knowledge for men. She writes, quote, "Here he is all of them, the preoccupied man, an artist, collector of experience, the skeptic angling his head, his thought tilting toward what I cannot know, the marshaller of knowledge, knuckling down a stack of books. Even the dissector, his scalp in his hand like a pen, poised above me, aimed straight for my heart," end quote. For Trethewey, the poet never critiques without also rendering some historical scapegoat as holy, and this is what I marvel at in her poetry, how the woman's body, and therefore her body, and therefore my body, all become worthy of poetic light, despite the sacrilege with which they have been treated in the past. Pilgrimage also refers to a tender-footed newcomer, and this too seems crucial to her work. In a poem entitled White Lies, the speaker confesses the way in which they distance themselves from Blackness through a series of white lies about where they live, how they dress, how they pass. But the last stanza describes a torrential justice. The speaker says, quote, "But I paid for it every time Mama found out. She laid her hands on me, then washed out my mouth with ivory soap. This is to purify," she said, "and cleanse your lying tongue." Believing her, I swallowed suds, thinking they'd work from the inside out, end quote. Why does this ending feel so oddly generous to me? Perhaps because it does what Trethewey's work does best. It is a lesson that doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like what is yet to come will come as a force. It lays the ground for an elevated consciousness, a newcomer with tender feet. Please help me welcome Natasha Trethewey to Boston University.
Thank you, Megan. That was lovely. And thank you also for your lovely reading. It's really wonderful to be here, to know that you're there in this format. It is strange. You said you kind of liked it. And I was thinking how I used to like giving a reading and having the theater dark so that I couldn't see the audience, which meant if I said difficult things, I couldn't see if people were frowning at me. So I guess that's the case now. But I don't know how I feel about it. Robert, it was good to see your face too. Annette, thank you for the wonderful discussion earlier and all of the MFA poets who joined us. I'm going to start with the first poem in my most recent collection, Monument. And what I have to tell you about it is that I just published a memoir about my mother. And I was working on that memoir during the same time that a lot of these poems in Monument were written. And it's because sometimes I was writing the prose and something would start to come out in me as a poem instead, even though it was on the same subject. And I'd have to turn that page of prose over and write a poem. I've often talked about how 2 existential wounds made me a poet. And the first one is pretty easy, and I think I've known it for a long time. And that is like the way that Auden described Yeats in his memorial when he writes, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. My native land, my Mississippi, my South, with its brutal history of racism and racial violence and oppression, inflicted my first wound." When I look back on my childhood, I can see that I was already writing poems about history. My deeper wound came later, though. And by the time I went to graduate school, carrying both of these wounds, trying to write about both of them, I had one of those moments that a lot of people have when someone tells you to abandon what it is you were given to write and write about something else. A famous professor of mine, as you'll hear in this poem, told me the entire quote is, "Unburden yourself of being Black, unburden yourself of the death of your mother, and write about the situation in Northern Ireland." By being Black, I think he meant that I needed to abandon my response to injustice and oppression and white supremacy. And yet, a child of miscegenation, born on Confederate Memorial Day in Mississippi, how could I? And how could I unburden myself of the death of my mother? I had one question in the meeting we had before about who the audience was. And I said, my audience I think of as everyone. I want to be clear and speak to everyone. But when I wrote this poem, I was thinking about all of the ridiculous things that people say to people who are survivors of domestic violence, things that people say about victims of domestic violence. Imperatives for carrying on in the aftermath. Do not hang your head or clench your fists when even your friend, after hearing the story, says, "My mother would never put up with that." Fight the urge to rattle off statistics that, more often, a woman who chooses to leave is then murdered. The 100th time your father says, "But she hated violence. Why would she marry a guy like that?" Don't waste your breath explaining again how abusers wait, are patient, that they don't beat you on the first date, sometimes not even the first few years of a marriage. Keep an impassive face whenever you hear "stand by your man," and let go your rage when you recall those words were advice given your mother. Try to forget the first trial before she was dead, when the charge was only attempted murder. Don't belabor the thinking or the sentence that allowed her ex-husband's release a year later, or the juror who said, "It's a domestic issue. They should work it out themselves." Just breathe when, after you read your poems about grief, a woman asks, "Do you think your mother was weak for men?" Learn to ignore subtext. Imagine a thought cloud above your head, dark and heavy with the words you cannot say. Let silence rain down. Remember, you were told by your famous professor that you should write about something else, unburden yourself of the death of your mother, and just pour your heart out in the poems. Ask yourself what's in your heart, that reliquary, blood locket and seed bed, and contend with what it means. The folk saying you learned from a Korean poet in Seoul, that one does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest, or like you carry her corpse on your back. It took me a long time, and it took me writing that memoir to really see the extent to which those two wounds of mine had been intertwined. And I feel it even more now as we're having all of these conversations and a national reckoning around police brutality and the kinds of monuments that we have to white supremacy that are meant to tell again and again African Americans to know your place. My mother died at the base of Stone Mountain, the largest monument to the Confederacy. And that's where the wounds are linked for me. Miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke two laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi. Something else that is on my mind right now is voter suppression and voter intimidation. And the history of this is in my family too. In the mid to late 60s, my grandmother lived across the street from the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Gulfport, Mississippi. And during that time, my mother and father and I lived with my grandmother in that house for a short time. The church didn't have its own driveway, so my grandmother always let the deacons park the church bus in her driveway. And there was a particular couple of weeks that the church was doing a voter registration drive to get disenfranchised African Americans registered to vote. And because of that, and because we were living in that house, we didn't know if the act of domestic terrorism was directed at us, that interracial family, or at the church for registering voters. But it was an act of voter intimidation nonetheless. Incident. We tell the story every year, how we peered from windows, shades drawn, though nothing really happened, the charred grass now green again. We peered from the windows, shades drawn, at the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, the charred grass still green. Then we darkened our rooms, lit the hurricane lamps. At the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, a few men gathered, white as angels in their gowns. We darkened our rooms and lit hurricane lamps, the wicks trembling in their fonts of oil. It seemed the angels had gathered, white men in their gowns. When they were done, they left quietly. No one came. The wicks trembled all night in their fonts of oil. By morning, the flames had all dimmed. When they were done, the men left quietly. No one came. Nothing really happened. By morning, all the flames had dimmed. We tell the story every year. My last collection, Thrall, was a book dedicated to my father. It was dedicated to him because in it, I needed to have a very difficult conversation with him in the only language that he would listen to, and that was poetry, because my father was also a poet. And the conversation begins in the Enlightenment. It begins with the ways that Enlightenment philosophers first codified ideas of racial difference and racial hierarchy, which form the bedrock of contemporary forms of white supremacy. What we're seeing emerge very virulently and vocally right now. But it's also about the idea of white supremacy that is even held by a father toward his beloved daughter. And what I mean by that is racial difference and hierarchy that my father could not unyoke himself from. And so I needed to talk to him about that, but I also needed to talk to my nation about that. One of the things that I did was to look back across time and space. I wanted to see all the ways that I could find representations of how some lives have consistently been devalued and valued less than other lives. What I discovered was the miracle of the black leg and representations of the myth of the miracle transplant, black donor, white recipient. The pictorial representations of this miracle transplant started happening around the 14th century, but before that, the written versions. They appear in altarpieces and paintings and carvings in many countries around the world. This is Miracle of the Black Leg. 1. Always the dark body hewn asunder. Always one man is healed, his sick limb replaced, placed in the other man's grave, the white leg buried beside the corpse or attached as if it were always there. If not for the dark appendage, you might miss the story beneath this story. What remains each time the myth changes. How, in one version, the doctors harvest the leg from a man 4 days dead in his tomb at the church of a martyr, or in another, desecrate a body fresh in the graveyard at St. Peter in chains. There was buried just today an Ethiopian. Even now, it stays with us. When we mean to uncover the truth, we dig, say, unearth. 2. Emblematic in paint, a signifier of the body's lacuna, the black leg is at once a grafted narrative, a redacted line of text, and in this scene, a dark stocking pulled above the knee. Here, the patient is sleeping, his head at rest in his hand. Beatific, he looks as if he'll wake from a dream. On the floor beside the bed, a dead Moor, hands crossed at the groin, the swapped limb white and rotting, fused in place. And in the corner, a question, poised as if to speak the syntax of sloughing a snake's curved form. It emerges from the mouth of a boy like a tongue, slippery and rooted in the body as knowledge. For centuries, this is how the myth repeats. The miracle in words or wood or paint is a record of thought. 3. See how the story changes. In one painting, the Ethiop is merely a body, featureless in a coffin, so black he has no face. In another, the patient at the top of the frame seems to writhe in pain, the black leg grafted to his thigh. Below him, a mirror of suffering, the blackamoor, his body a fragment, arched across the doctor's lap as if dying from his wound. If not imminence, the soul's bright anchor, blood passed from one to the other, what knowledge haunts each body, what history, what phantom ache, one man always low, in a grave or on the ground, the other up high, closer to heaven, one man always diseased, the other a body in service, plundered. 4. Both men are alive in Bioldo's carving. In twinned relief, they hold the same posture, the same pained face, each man reaching to touch his left leg. The black man on the floor holds his stump. Above him, the doctor restrains the patient's arm as if to prevent him touching the dark amendment of flesh. How not to see it? The men bound one to the other, symbiotic, one man rendered expendable, the other worthy of this sacrifice. In version after version, even when the Ethiopian isn't there, the leg is a stand-in, a black modifier against the white body, a piece cut off, as in the origin of the word comma, caesura in a story that's still being written. And also, when I wanted to go back to see these representations of racial difference and racial hierarchy, I went to the 18th century, to the age of reason, and I discovered the Mexican Costa paintings. And across the 18th century, the Mexican Costa paintings represented the mixed blood unions that were taking place in the colony. They were done in series of 16. They always began with the white Spaniard father and showed the different blood mixtures. I was fascinated by the fact that not only did you have the imagery, but also a taxonomy, the names of the mixed race offspring of these unions also there on the painting. One of the other things that was fascinating to me about this is the belief that it is in many ways still with us, that over a few generations, indigenous blood could be purified to whiteness, but that the taint of African blood was irreversible. So you had names like mulatto returning backwards, hold yourself in midair, and I don't understand you. This is from a series by Juan Rodriguez Juarez, circa 1715. Taxonomy. 1. De Español y de India produce mestizo. The canvas is a leaden sky behind them, heavy with words, gold letters inscribing an equation of blood. This plus this equals this, as if a contract with nature or a museum label, ethnographic, precise. See how the father's hand beneath its crown of lace curls around his daughter's head. She's nearly fair as he is. Calidad, see it in the brooch at her collar, the lace framing her face. An infant, she is borne over the servant's left shoulder, bound to him by a sling, the plain blue cloth knotted at his throat. If the father, his hand on her skull, divines, as the physiognomist does, the mysteries of her character, discursive, legible on her light flesh, in the soft curl of her hair, we cannot know it. So gentle the eye he turns toward her. The mother, glancing sideways toward him, the scarf on her head, white as his face, his powdered wig, gestures with one hand a shape like the letter C. See, she seems to say, what we have made. The servant, still a child, cranes his neck, turns his face up toward all of them. He is dark as history, origin of the word native, the weight of blood, a pale mistress on his back, heavier every year. 2. De Español y Negra produce mulatto. Still, the centuries have not dulled the sullenness of the child's expression. If there is light inside him, it does not shine through the paint that holds his face in profile, his domed forehead, eyes nearly closed beneath a heavy brow. Though inside, the boy's father stands in his cloak and hat, it's as if he's just come in or that he's leaving. We see him transient, rolling a cigarette, myopic, his eyelids drawn against the child passing before him. At the stove, the boy's mother contorts, watchful, her neck twisting on its spine, red beads yoked at her throat like a necklace of blood, her face so black she nearly disappears into the canvas, the dark wall upon which we see the words that name them. What should we make of any of this? Remove the words above their heads, put something else in place of the child, a table perhaps upon which the man might set his hat, or a dog upon which to bestow the blessing of his touch, and the story changes. The boy is a palimpsest of paint, layers of color, history rendering him that precise shade of in-between. Before this, he was nothing, blank canvas, before image or word, before a last brushstroke fixed him in his place. 3. De Español y Mestiza produce Castiza. How not to see in this gesture the mind of the colony? In the mother's arms, the child hinged at her womb, dark cradle of mixed blood, call it Mexico, turns toward the father, reaching to him as if back to Spain, to the promise of blood alchemy, 3 easy steps to purity. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. From a mestizo and a Spaniard, a castizo. From a castizo and a Spaniard, a Spaniard. We see her here, 1 generation away, nearly slipping her mother's careful grip. 4. The Book of Castas. Call it the Catalogue of Mixed Bloods, or the Book of Not Spaniard, not white, but mulatto returning backwards, or Hold Yourself in Midair, and the Morisca, the Lobo, the Chino, Sambo, Albino, and the No Te Entiendo, the I Don't Understand You. Guidebook to the colony, record of each crossed birth. It is the typology of taint, of stain, blemish, sullying spot, that which can be purified, that which cannot. Canaan's black fate, how like a dirty joke it seems. What do you call that space between the dark geographies of sex? Call it the taint, as in taint one and it taint the other, illicit and yet naming still what is between. Between her parents, the child, mulatto, returning backwards, cannot slip their hold, the triptych their bodies make, in paint, in blood, her name, written down in the book of castas, all her kind, in thrall to a word. Gonna finish up with just a couple more poems. This is the last poem I wrote for that book, and in order to write it, I had to take my father to Monticello. He first took me there to Thomas Jefferson's home, perhaps 30 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. It is now the official position that Thomas Jefferson fathered several of Sally Hemings' children, and whereas it was once taboo to bring that up when you take the tour, now the docent will mention it at the beginning. And so the conversations you might overhear there have changed, but I think the underlying ideology has not. Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves, that his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. And I'm going to close with the very last poem in Monument. It's after a painting by Miguel Cabrera, his portrait of Saint Gertrude from 1763. Articulation. In the legend, Saint Gertrude is called to write after seeing in a vision the Sacred Heart of Christ. Cabrera paints her among the instruments of her faith, quill, inkwell, an open book, rings on her fingers like Christ's many wounds, the heart emblazoned on her chest, the holy infant nestled there as if sunk deep in a wound. Against the dark backdrop, her face is a wafer of light. How not to see in the saint's image my mother's last portrait? The dark backdrop, her dress black as a habit, the bright edge of her afro ringing her face with light. And how not to recall her many wounds, ring finger shattered, her ex-husband's bullet finding her temple, lodging where her last thought lodged. 3 weeks gone, my mother came to me in a dream, her body whole again, but for one perfect wound, the singular articulation of all of them. A hole, center of her forehead, the size of a wafer, light pouring from it. How then could I not answer her life with mine, she who saved me with hers? And how could I not, bathed in the light of her wound, find my calling there? Thank you.
Natasha, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. We're just switching back over to panel view shortly with the help of our trusty technician here. In the meantime, attendees, please go ahead and send us your questions here in the chat box. You should be able to reach us, and we will start answering them shortly once we get into a gallery view. Natasha, while I have you still on the screen, I'm going to ask the first question that I see here to you. And that is, much of your poetry has to do with memory, and many of your poems are like memoir compressed into several lines. What compelled you to write your memoir when you did?
Well, I would say that my poems are about the intersections between memory and history. I write a good deal about history, particularly those intersections and contentions between personal memory and cultural or historical memory or history writ large. The reason I wrote my memoir is that the more recognition I got as a poet, the more my story was written about in articles. And my backstory became part of the story written about me. And in that backstory was a brief mention of my mother. Often she was mentioned as a footnote, but always diminished simply as victim or murdered woman. And I felt that she was being erased. And I decided that if my backstory was going to be part of the story and she was in it, that I needed to tell her story and to place her in her proper context as the person who made me a poet. My life with her and losing her made me a poet. I had to write to deal with that great trauma. That's why I wrote a memoir.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you so much for your reading, you and Meg both. It was fantastic and an absolute treat to have you. So again, I wish we were in person, but this is a close second. Next question is for Meg. Meg, your poems have such a vivid sense of place. The jungle and Amsterdam struck me as cinematic. Can you tell us about any influences from visual art, film, and or music in your work?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. And also just want to say thank you, Natasha. That was a really moving reading. I still feel like I'm kind of reeling from it. You know, there are poets that I really love that kind of engage with the cinematic. Like I always mention O'Hara, but even, to a kind of stranger degree, some Irish poets like Mev McGuckian, who I really love, who are kind of able to take these sort of surreal images, like she'll say like something like a flinging staircase. And I'm like, what would that look like? Does that really work? And it kind of does work. So in terms of poets, I think that there's definitely a kind of history of these poets who are interested in sort of apparition, even if the apparition is sort of nonsensical. when it comes to the filmic or the cinematic, I think that, there is a lot of, I grew up with like watching some really like classical Bollywood films that felt really like I was resisting that at a young age, and kind of thought it was something that I wasn't engaged with, but I was definitely engaged with my subconscious. And probably more than anything, maybe more than image, the sense of pace, because those films had a lot of longevity to them, but also things were constantly changing all the time. And so the sense of attention of like maybe some non-Western cinema was kind of interesting for me to engage with. I'm not sure if it had so much of a direct response, but definitely Pushpampala P, who's the the visual artist who did the cover of my book, she was a big influence, and she kind of undoes these Bollywood film heroines with these sort of vampy gothic looking ladies who are hyper femme but also look like they want to murder you, and I sort of like that as well, the subversion of the role of the femme in these kinds of cinematic genres.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from Sean Beckett, one of our MFA students. Professor Trethewey, you have written several poems from the perspective of historical figures. How do you go about writing from the mind of someone else?
I do a lot of research. I like spending time in the archives and finding evidence and traces of characters that I might want to imagine myself into. So, for example, in writing from the point of view of a Black Union soldier in Native Guard, I read a lot of letters and diaries that allowed me to sort of, create a little bit of the voice of, someone who might have lived. With my persona in Ophelia, the same thing. Reading memoirs from people written around the same time. For example, it's not exactly a memoir, but a diary of a prostitute named Mamie who lived at the same time as my Ophelia did, allowed me to imagine sort of the kinds of things that they were writing about and thinking about. And then, I think you always have to give to your characters a little bit of your own interior life. I remember reading Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being, in which he sort of talks about that each of his characters is some unrealized version of himself. And so I give to my characters some of my own interior life.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. Our next question is from Denise Irvin. For both of the readers, thank you for sharing your amazing work. Can you talk a bit about your process? When, where, and how do you write? And how do you know when you're done with a piece and can stop editing?
Oh, you're going to give me that one first. Okay. I feel like I'm writing all the time. I write when I'm taking long walks, because that's when I have a lot of time to think and to feel the cadence of my breath and my footfall. I like that a lot. My study is on the third floor of my house, and so I like feeling like I'm writing up in the attic and the brains of the house. I also take a long time because I spend a lot of time revising. Sometimes things have to go away in a drawer and don't come out for years. It takes me years sometimes to finish some poems. but I'm continuing to work on them all the time. While I'm writing, I usually memorize my poems so that I can work on, I have them always with me. And, you know, I don't know when I know that they're done. At least I only know when I can walk away and stop working on them. I want to hear what Megan says about that.
I'm not like a hyper extrovert. And so like I feel like I write a lot with people. Like I like, you know, I need people in order to write. I need to have a kind of it can be strangers too. I mean, it doesn't have to just be people I know, but the pandemic's been kind of interesting because of that. Like it's definitely changed the way I write and the way I get energy in the world. Um, I think that I write almost exclusively at night. Just like a night person. I have a lot of admiration for people who are morning people. They seem like they have a gravitas that I really aspire to, but I have not yet arrived at that gravitas yet. So I don't know, you kind of have to like, you know, at night it's when the wheels start. Like at 11 p.m. is like when I like actually feel like I wake up in terms of like things are starting to connect and become associative. In terms of revision, I'm really not so good at that. I think I can tend to kill whatever was there in the beginning. You need some good readers. I have some good friends who are actually, you know, some of them who are here who I send annoyingly probably my poems out to like in bunches a few times a year. And I'm like, just, yeah, like, have I arrived at this thing yet? And that is helpful because also it's good to have readers who don't write anything like you. And it's good to read poetry that you don't write anything like. I mean, I read exclusively poetry almost that I don't write anything like. And I get a lot of pleasure out of it because it helps me understand that the process that I have is a craft process, not just an interior monologue, right? It's like I've never put, you know, 3 multi-syllabic words right next to each other. That's insane, like, you know, and to me, like those choices start to become more apparent. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are just a few things that I sort of abide by.
Thank you. I think that answers it pretty well. The next question is for Natasha. Can you talk about how you deal with vulnerability from a craft perspective? How do you balance the artifice of creating with being authentic?
That's a good question. Well, you know, I think a couple of things. I am always trying very hard to say the true thing. And in poetry, I find that the artifice, you know, whether it's the heavier mask of a persona or just the sort of the usual mask that is the artifice of the poem, and the formal qualities of the poem that allow me a kind of, I think, fierce attention to the truth that is harder when I don't have that, when I don't have the scaffolding of form and the artifice of a poem. I learned that even more potently while working on a memoir, because, you know, I found that, you know, the same things that I could deal with in a poem, because I have restraint and silence and distance, were very different to do in prose that asked of me to not wear a mask. It was harder. But I think that it is about restraint and silence. um, and the grip of form of a poem that allows, I think, dealing with something that would otherwise render me so vulnerable as to not be able to speak anymore, the way I'm struggling even to talk about this now.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question is for both poets. What is your relationship to the line as a unit? And this is funny, we talked about this in our earlier conversation, so I'm looking forward to hear what you say this time. But what is your relationship to the line as a unit? You both have poems that are free verse and poems that are more formal. I'm thinking of Trethewey's Myth and Fernandez's White Insomnia. Do you think of these formalities as an expression of reverence or a resistance to it?
An expression of reverence for what? For form?
I think for formality. What is your relationship to the line as a unit? You both have poems that are free verse and poems that are more formal. Are the formalities an expression of reverence, or are the formalities a resistance to it?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the poem Myth. I mean, obviously I think about the line as a unit. There is, of course, the sentence and the syntax and the rhetorical positioning of the line in an entire poem, but I believe that a line also has to be a unit unto itself. And so that's why in working on a poem like Myth, when I was halfway done with it, that meant I only had half of that poem, up until the asterisk that's in the middle of it. That's when I started reading the lines out of place, backwards, out of their syntactical and rhetorical position in the poem, so that I could test them as lines, as units in themselves. So, yeah.
I said this a little bit earlier, but that I believe that the improvisational has a lot of reference. And I think that, I think also that a focus on orality and on the conversational is the wrong word, but like I don't know, I like a line that feels a little bit unpredictable. I like a line that stalls out. I like a line that buys itself time. I like a line, and not just in poetry, but also, as I said, during a workshop today, in like hip hop and like in blues, and thinking about like, what is the syntax of stalling, right? Like, I think about that a lot. Like, oh, I don't really know how to get to the next idea. What's the line that will get me to the next leap? How do I make this leap? And the leap is it's a form of time travel, really, right? And it needs some improvisation to it. To me, that feels deeply irreverent. I'm writing like some sonnets right now, and oh my God, they're so difficult to write for me because they're not about it doesn't allow for a kind of excess that my poems definitely feel like they have, but I love it because it is a way of getting to something much more distilled as opposed to diluted, right? And what I love, every formal poem that I read that I love feels like a direct hit, It doesn't feel like this ongoing fluid thing. Like if I am listening to like Ginsberg or reading Ginsberg or O'Hara, it feels kind of like you're sort of in the wave of it. But if I read like early Gwendolyn Brooks, you know, I feel like I'm actually, it's like a direct hit. It feels like a concentration of water or something. That's the only way I can say it. They're both kind of reverent, I guess. They're both baptismal. I don't know, but they both feel, but they feel like really different kinds of forces, if that makes sense.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, definitely. Next question is from Jose to both Meg and Natasha. Thank you for sharing your powerful work. What advice would you give for poets who address social, political, or historical concerns?
Ooh. What advice? Oh, that's, well, first of all, yes, keep doing it because I certainly appreciate that you are doing that kind of work. The advice, oh, you know, right now I'm thinking about something that Meg said that I wanted to kind of go back to because we didn't get to talk about it. But you were talking about, Meg, being in this moment where, you know, this so much is happening with our racial reckoning, with the pandemic, that you find it hard to write right now because you're still in it. I feel the same way. And I always admire those poets who can sit down and respond to exactly what is happening right now. I can't do that. I think that that's one of the reasons that, or I can't do it directly. That's one of the reasons that I always turn to history. And when I'm writing about history, I'm always writing about the present, but I do it by looking at something else because it's so hard for me to look dead on and write about directly what's happening in the moment. And I think sometimes it's because I actually need to process it a little bit. I mean, that was certainly true with my grief as well. I couldn't write, you know, poems that dealt with my grief for almost 20 years. So you may not be that kind of poet. Maybe you are someone who can sit right down and respond directly to what's happening. But if you're like me, you might need to look at history because history still shows us everything that we're seeing right now. I would have thought that, you know, after I wrote Thrall, which is for me all about white supremacy and dealing with that, we might not be right back where, you know, where we were before. And yet here we are. I thought when I wrote about, you know, monuments that were erasing part of our story and replacing it only with a narrative of white supremacy in Native Guard, that maybe we were beyond that, but we're not. So to find those places in history that illuminate our contemporary moment, I think is one of the ways to write about social justice issues.
Yeah, I would say pretty much the same, which is that one of the issues I think that I see is that we're really presentist in a lot of our critiques, right? And that going back to history, like, you know, read the Black Arts Movement, read Etheridge Knight, read Gwendolyn Brooks, as I said, like, you know, there are a lot of good models for how people resisted and how people wrote that literature. And that I think is sometimes can be very revealing and can be very expansive. I also don't think it's a thing one needs to shy away from. You know, as I said with the students today, I said, you know, sometimes we feel like we can't say things that feel politically obvious because we think that it's easy to say, but it's not. Like, the president of the country is literally calling on like the Proud Boys. We're not in a dominant space. You know, I think that that's the kind of joke is the wrong word. That's the kind of misleading information we're giving ourselves. No, what you're saying is not obvious to so many people. And so you have to say things with the knowledge that they're not reified in the world, because they're not, you know. On the other hand, I think that allowing your work to delve into the complexities of contradictions is really useful. And I also think during this moment, a good thing to do is to do something outside of your expertise. So instead of walking around like New York and trying to write poems about like how Times Square looks like a graveyard of screens right now, I just like will go there and I will draw. And I can't draw at all like an amateur, the empty Times Squares, because there's, and you know, we're all in our amateur mode. Like maybe you're learning Italian, or you're, you know what I mean, you're like, you know, this is a good time to be an amateur, because like when you're pressed and you're traumatized, and we're all traumatized right now, I think in trauma you don't need expertise. You don't need to write the perfect poem. You need to like compose a really shitty piece of music and then write the poem about the shitty piece of music you wrote when the nation state was completely falling in on itself, you know? So to get you through, be an amateur. That's what I would say.
Thank you. And we have time for just one or two more questions very quickly. For Professor Trethewey, as you write your ekphrastic poems, do you consider the form of the painting or a narrative about the painting primarily, or do you consider them equally?
Well, you know, I look at everything from, you know, I try to, you know, look at brushstrokes, you know, if I can, to and paint the actual, you know, the thing itself, what it's made of, texture. I also look at um, the sort of narrative suggestions that are in the painting, but then it's also about, you know, what happens when we look at a work of art, what it kind of animates in us. And that's the emotional level that is evoked by a painting. So, you know, for example, when I was looking at all of those Costa paintings, not until I started describing what I saw did I realize that I was really focusing on the relationship between the father and the child in each of those. I didn't try to see that, and I didn't set out to see that. That's what was drawing me to those paintings, though. And not until I wrote about them did I see that that's was leading me toward a way of interacting with my own father.
Thank you. And I know we're almost out of time. So for the very last question, do either of you have any quick tips as teachers for writing prompts or practice that you find particularly helpful to your students? And in this difficult and complex time, what are you reading and thinking about now? Is the reading for you a solace or escape or something else? What is engaging you in this time?
I would say imitation is the greatest prompt to me. Reading another poet whose work I admire, and trying to imitate particular poems. I've noticed that, you know, even my beginning students, when they imitate a poem, um, they write some of the best poems that they've ever written. And they're so different from the poem that they imitate, but somehow following the thinking, the patterns of and syntax and line of another poet really opens a pathway into your own poems. I do that constantly myself. Yeah, that would be my assignment.
I actually did this assignment where I'm not great at technology, so it was kind of a thing, but we're all remote and my students are all over the world. And I did this like sensory ethnography assignment where they had to take an audio clip of them doing some kind of routine wherever they were in the world. And then they had to upload the audio clip onto this Google map. So you could see where they all were. One was in Vietnam, one was in Hawaii, and you could listen to what they were doing. And they were so poetic, actually. They weren't like speaking, but they were like cooking dinner, or they were washing their faces, or one of them was like, I don't know, someone works on a horse. I was on a horse farm and was out like on a horse. And it was a way somatically of feeling like we were embodied together, even though we were remote. And just visualizing distance, I think, is really helpful for students right now. In terms of books, I am reading a lot of theory. I'm not reading any novels right now. I'm reading poetry and theory. I'm been teaching a lot of In the Wake by Christina Sharp, which is a great book, difficult book, but a really great book. But for some reason, no novels. I don't have the attention span for them right now.
Thank you. Well, thank you both so much again, and I'll pass the torch over to Robert to just close us out for the evening. And thank you to all our participants for coming.
Thanks.
Robert, you just need to unmute yourself.
The two words thank you really do it. If we were meeting in person, we'd be grateful. BU and Creative Writing would, and I would be grateful for the truth and the art. Because this was done remotely, we can add thank you, Natasha and Meg, for the reality and the art. Also, in relation to the word remote, additional thanks for the candor and generosity that made this feel immediate, urgent, and close up. Thanks very much, and hooray. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. It was good to see you.
Same.